Hello. Thank you everyone for joining us today. The topic for our webinar today is energy storage for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. This webinar is a presentation of the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, also known as STAP. STAP is a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Electricity, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Clean Energy States Alliance. Before we pass it over to our exciting panel of speakers today, I'd like to go over some very quick webinar logistics. You may notice that we are using a newly updated version of GoToWebinar. We thank you for your patience. As you just saw, we're still getting used to it. We do encourage you to provide any feedback about your experience with this new platform in the post-webinar survey or via email or however you would like to let us know. Just a couple of orienting facts here. You're all in listen-only mode. You can submit your questions and your comments via the questions panel on your webinar console, and we will save some time at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. We will have speaker bios available for you shortly in the materials section. If you'd like to turn on captions, you can do so. That just appears on your end. We're not responsible for any misspellings of any names or storage technologies. Those are good but not great. And this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email within about 48 hours with a copy of the slides and the recording. And we'll also post all these materials on CISA's website, cisa.org/webinars. So with that, I am happy to pass it over now to our moderator for today's webinar, my colleague Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is a Senior Project Director at the Clean Energy States Alliance.
Thanks, Samantha, and welcome to the webinar. We have a fantastic set of speakers today and a very interesting topic. So I'm going to briefly introduce CISA and the STAP program, and then we will go ahead and introduce our speakers and get into it. If you're not familiar with CISA, the Clean Energy States Alliance, we are celebrating 20 years of nonprofit activities, and what we do basically is we work with our members who are state energy agencies across the nation, and we help them to develop and improve their programs and policies around all sorts of clean energy initiatives. Next slide, please. You can see that we have on this slide the logos of the CISA membership, and go ahead to the next slide, please. In addition to our member-oriented activities, we have other kinds of technology-specific programs. One of them is STAP, the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, which we have been conducting now for over 12 years. This is done under contract with Sandia National Laboratories. The funding comes from U.S. DOE Office of Electricity, and we're fortunate enough to have Dr. Imre Juk with us today, who provides that support from DOE. The STAP program is essentially a partnership between DOE, National Labs, CISA, and states. And the partnership's goal is to facilitate the development and deployment of energy storage projects across the country. Also to disseminate information about energy storage through webinars like this one, and also through reports and case studies and conference presentations, and also to support energy office policy development in the states. So we work with regulators and policymakers and help them to figure out ways to advance energy storage policy and programs. Next slide, please. So as I said earlier, we want to recognize Dr. Juk, who's with us today from DOE, and also Waylon Clark, the Energy Storage Program Demonstration Team Lead at Sandia National Laboratories, who is not able to be with us today. And we really appreciate their guidance and support. Next slide, please. So I think this is where I introduce the speakers. So in order of speaking, we will hear first from Dr. Imre Juk, the Chief Scientist for Energy Storage at U.S. DOE Office of Electricity. Then we will hear from Brian McCauley, a Principal Consultant with Verdant Associates. And Brian has extensive experience providing program evaluation of distributed energy resources and market research to utilities and regulatory agencies, and he'll be presenting on the California SGIP program. And we'll then hear from Stefan Wallenberg, a director at Sustainable Energy Advantage, who leads the firm's energy storage practice. Stefan helps public sector clients evaluate and design clean energy and storage policies, provides strategic support to private sector clients, and manages the firm's Clean Peak Market Outlook service. And he'll be presenting on the Massachusetts Clean Peak Standard. Before we start, I wanted to say two additional things. One is please type your questions in as they occur to you, and I will be reading through those as the presentations are being made. And at the end of the presentations, we'll get to as many of those questions as we possibly can within our time. The other thing I wanted to say was just by way of introducing the topic, energy storage is increasingly seen as a key technology for the scaling up of renewable generation, which makes possible retirement of fossil fuel generation. And this is very important to states because I'd say most states have some kind of decarbonization policy and programs in place, whether that looks like a renewable portfolio standard or decarbonization goals or net zero goals. And increasingly, we're seeing states go to 100% decarbonization targets. And that really requires that renewable generation and energy storage be scaled up. And so this is the topic today, is looking at the ways in which a couple of leading state programs are incentivizing energy storage or requiring energy storage to be employed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in California and in Massachusetts. Two very different programs. One's an incentive program. The other is a procurement target for peak demand hours. And we'll hear how those programs are doing and whatever the lessons that have been learned so far are about these two very different models. So with that, I will pass the microphone over to Dr. Chook for his introductory remarks.
Hello, as mentioned by Todd, I am Chief Scientist for the Office of Electricity. Some 15 or maybe 20 years ago, we had two demonstrations going on, one in California and one in New York State with CEC and NYSERDA. And the aim of the demonstration was to show that frequency regulation could be very nicely done with energy storage. The particular storage we used at that time was flywheels, about 1 megawatt each. But after we showed that it can be done, the question came up, well, does it reduce greenhouse gases? And let's do a quick thought experiment. Suppose the energy is entirely renewable energy, solar energy. In that case, the energy storage will be just shifting around carbon-free energy, and there is no carbon penalty. Now suppose it's entirely fossil fuel energy. In that case, the amount of carbon that you get is exactly what you are. It depends on the efficiency of the energy storage. So whatever you lose during the storage, that's your carbon penalty. In the real world, it would be a mix, and you get both carbon-free and carbon-containing energy. Nonetheless, we were able to show that for all areas except one, the net balance came out positive. And after that, it's history by now, but FERC introduced pay for performance, and energy storage had its first positive application that actually paid back and reduced carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Nowadays, the situation is much more complex, and that's why it's very worthwhile to reanalyze the situation and look at the current grid and the way it runs nowadays. And that's what we will do in the next hour. And I look forward to hearing the presentations. Thank you. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much, Emery. We're going to go now to Brian McCauley from Verdant Associates. Brian, if you bring up your camera and slides.
Yeah, I believe Samantha was going to bring up my slides. Yep. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. We've got some limited time, and I certainly want to give Stefan and it's time for a Q&A. So my plan today is really to cover several things, both a kind of a brief history of the Self-Generation Incentive Program for folks who aren't familiar with the program in California, some of the measurement and evaluation objectives, and then a lot of the information that I'll be kind of presenting today is based on a recently completed impacts evaluation of the program for calendar years 21 and 22. This is for behind-the-meter electrochemical batteries receiving SCHIP incentives. And exploring different ways in which these energy storage technologies are being utilized, and really how that behavior, how that utilization, timing and magnitude of charge and discharge impact things like greenhouse gas emissions. And then we have this sort of observed impacts from the program. What we find from what systems are doing on a regular day basis, and we're going to compare that to how systems could optimally be discharged for a given purpose. So using a greenhouse gas signal to see with perfect foresight how much more value could be extracted from behind-the-meter energy storage if dispatched to maximize GHG reductions. And hopefully I have a little bit of time for conclusions and some program design improvements. Oops. Let's go back one. So starting with results here, usually we kind of walk through things and then kind of the results come at the end. I wanted to sort of highlight sort of where the program has been from a GHG perspective, and I'm utilizing the last 5 evaluations that Verdant has conducted on behalf of the SCHIP working group and the California Public Utility Commission. These kind of pinwheels represent the last 5 years, so 2008 through 2022, going from center out, and sort of tracking the per unit impacts over time. So the amount of GHG reduction in kilograms per kWh positive. So if we're going clockwise, you're seeing a positive, a benefit, a GHG emission reduction from SCHIP storage performance. If you're seeing it going counterclockwise, it is negative, and that means that the program as a whole, either as a residential sector on the left, the middle pinwheel, non-res, or the total program, was actually increasing emissions in aggregate for a given calendar evaluation year. The first thing you'll notice is you see the last 2 years, 2021 and 2022, significant improvements in emission reductions, particularly in the residential space. But you do see in those 2 years, the non-res sector highlighted here, finally turning the corner and reducing emissions, whereas in the past they had been increasing emissions. And so I want to highlight that because what we are looking at here from the terms of a timeline of the SCHIP, it was developed and created in 2001 in response to the energy crises in California. And initially, it was, as the name suggested, a self-generation program, incentives for behind-the-meter, early rooftop solar in California, fuel cells, wind turbines, IC engines. It wasn't until about a decade later where behind-the-meter energy storage became eligible as a technology. The big important transition, I think, in the program was this California Senate Bill 412, where it actually modified the primary purpose of the SGIP from peak load reduction to GHG emission reductions. The program has seen many iterations since that time, a decade of changing, refunding, where the budget of the program went largely to storage. Incentive levels differed based on different budget categories. And based on the evaluation results, they showing that energy storage was increasing emissions in the evaluation years of 2017, 2018. There was a GHG working group established, and they did many things, but one of the things was to create a digital GHG signal to provide developers and manufacturers to have a better granular understanding of what grid conditions are and see if batteries could be utilized to be more focused in on trying to reduce GHG. There was decision language also that kind of included compliance and operational requirements that address GHG impacts. And then, here we are today. And just highlighting this is the report, the most recently established published report for 2001 and 2022. We, as the independent evaluator of the SGIP, we evaluate a number of metrics. You can see them highlighted here. You can certainly review the report if you'd like, but we're going to focus in on that third bullet, the environmental impacts. And these ongoing kind of annual impact evaluations are critical in terms of assessing the SGIP's effectiveness and ability to meet its goals. And just to frame sort of the population, we're looking at here sort of what the scale of the program is. As of the end of 2022, when that most recent evaluation was published, the SGIP composed of about 37,000 systems paid over time from that first system paid its incentive in 2012 through the end of 2022, representing about 1,300 megawatt hours of capacity. Early on, it was largely a non-residential program. These bars represent the cumulative capacity of the program throughout the years, and these lines represent the cumulative growth in project count over time. So you can see here by the slope of this line, really beginning in 2017, you see that the program is really largely not a residential program in terms of project count. Obviously, storage systems that are installed in commercial and industrial facilities are much larger, so there's about an equal split between the capacity in the program between res and non-res. And I just put a little note here, since this is a 2022 study, almost 2 years have passed. I reviewed the program tracking data recently, and as of today, there are well over 45,000 systems that have been received incentives, representing over 2,000 megawatt hours of capacity. And just a brief, oops, let's go back. Sorry, these things are not advancing. Apologies, we're having a lag over here. So just a quick brief just discussion about evaluation approaches. There's a lot of metrics that we develop that are very specific to the battery telemetry. Efficiencies and utilization. You can sum the total charge of a system over a given period of time, divided by the total discharge of the system, discharge over charge, and get a round-trip efficiency of a system, similarly with cycles and capacity factors. There are some metrics that we develop that are based on consumption at the meter in the absence of the SGIP technology. So we're utilizing not having AMI data from a customer that had previous to the installation of the energy storage system. We're looking at an observable counterfactual to measure the impact of the program intervention. And that little kind of graph on the right just kind of depicts what we do is in terms of that black line that represents the metered load that the utility would see, delivered and received load, and then sort of backing out the impact of the storage system, what that load would have looked like in the absence of the storage. So you can imagine from a GHG perspective, systems could provide GHG emission reductions relative to that counterfactual if emissions avoided during discharge are greater than emission increases during the charging. And this kind of takes out the storage, for example, and looks at sort of what's going on at the grid scale. Here we have kind of two typical days. We have a Sunday spring day in 2022 and we have the peak CAISO day, that's the peak system load on September 6th of 2022 on the right. You see a couple things here. I'm doing the shape of the GHG, sorry, the CAISO load, both the gross load, and then the green line is the CAISO net load, which is the load minus contributions from renewables on both of those days. You see that there's greater magnitude of system load on peak days. You also see during some of those spring days where there's ample grid scale bulk PV generating, and some of those high intensive demands like AC are not being utilized like they are in summertime from behind the meter end use customers. You see periods where marginal emissions, these black bars, are zero, meaning that the marginal unit on the marginal unit generator unit is a grid scale PV. And then on the peak day, you don't see the same thing. Marginal emissions never go to zero, but they certainly are lower in the morning before the ramp during the afternoon and early evening. I've also boxed off the 4 to 9 on-peak period, which is the on-peak period here in California. Just to highlight that they're the sort of what's going on the grid in terms of the maximum megawatts of generation relative to the marginal emissions of those generators. So in terms of looking at GHG and looking at it to optimize GHG reductions, you'd certainly want to be charging a battery, behind the meter battery, during these periods of lower marginal emissions and be discharging the battery during some of these higher marginal emission periods. Just a quick blurb on the sort of the characteristics. I have an appendix here also with the non-res kind of storage dispatch behavior, but in the program of 37,000 systems, 97% of the residential storage fleet is paired with solar PV with 3% standalone systems. Almost invariably, residential storage systems are charging from early morning on-site PV. And they're discharging, I kind of put into 4 different categories: self-consumption, which is charging from solar, and then discharging the battery to zero out imported load throughout the day. Time use arbitrage without export, very similar to self-consumption, except that zero out of imported load is really just dedicated to the on-peak period. So if the customer has a 4 to 9 on-peak in their bill, the battery is just discharging exclusively during that 4 to 9 period and remaining idle thereafter. We see time use arbitrage with export. So some systems are doing this regularly, discharging 40 or 50 or 60% of the battery during strategic hours on peak. And then also some systems that are doing arbitrage without export normally, but discharging to export during specific events. Demand response events, particularly like the Emergency Load Reduction Program, ELRP, or the programs like that. And then we have a very small cohort of underutilized or backup systems. These are not allowed in the SGIP. Utilization is an important metric and requirement for the program. But we do see it every so often, and I'll kind of get into what the impacts of that are. And this just kind of gives you just some load shapes and looking at sort of how different operating modes, how the load shapes differ based on whether they're time use arbitrage, backup, or self-consumption. This red line, this dotted red line represents the battery net discharge. So that when it's negative, the battery is charging. When it's positive, it's discharging. And then we have the net load, which is this dark black line, and then the light green line representing that sort of baseline counterfactual. So when the battery is charging, that shaded red area represents an increase in customer load relative to what it would have been without the battery. When this green area is shaded, that represents a decrease in customer loads. The battery is discharging to provide behind the meter sort of relief for the customer. For time use arbitrage customers, you see that battery discharge is only during the on-peak period. Backup systems, they're doing nothing. That flat line represents an idle system. And then self-consumption looks very similar to the time use arbitrage, except for that you see discharge occurring outside of that on-peak period. This is a heat map of both the PV paired systems in the residential program as well as the standalone systems. We see PV paired systems charging, like I mentioned earlier. This is now looking at average hourly discharge by hour of the day and month. And you see that most systems are discharging almost exclusively during those early on-site generating hours. Systems are discharging during the on-peak period. And then standalone systems are discharging on peak, but you see that they are discharging overnight, not during on-site PV generating hours, because these are standalone systems not paired with PV. And what does this mean? So I'm looking now at sort of that same behavior, looking at battery discharge, battery charge, these dark black lines, and light green discharge, and how those align with marginal emissions. So this is the summer sort of marginal emission shape for systems, on the grid, and then this is the behavior of behind the meter battery storage technologies. So you can see right away with arbitrage that there is more grid scale bulk PV generation during the day, obviously when the sun is plentiful. The same is true for rooftop solar behind the meter. So batteries are charging the batteries during PV generating hours are coincident to grid scale PV generating, where there's lower marginal emissions. And then during the evening, during that on-peak time, batteries are discharging, which are coincident to some of those higher GHG as PV, grid scale PV wanes and more traditional fossil fuel burning generators come online. These are individual projects. These little dots on the bottom is looking at the sort of contribution, the GHG reduction moving left along the horizontal axis, increase in GHG by project going right. And then sort of on the vertical axis, we're looking at cycles, so it's sort of a proxy for utilization. And each of these individual projects represents sort of, what a PV paired system in green versus what a standalone system are doing over here to the right. And you can clearly see a correlation between increases in utilization and sort of GHG emission reductions. Standalone systems are increasing emissions slightly, these little dark bots. And then solar PV charging is obviously critical to emission reductions, as you can see from here. Over here on the right is those sort of different use cases, arbitrage versus nothing versus self-consumption. You see that arbitrage and self-consumption, both of those operating modes lead to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, while nothing, which is basically a battery idle, is contributing very slightly to GHG emission increases because the battery is idle, it's got a parasitic loads. If it's being underutilized, there's also the energy losses from the AC/DC power conversion. And now, so we're taking a step back. So it looks like, the program is doing a good job of reducing emissions, but is there any value being left on the table currently? And so what we want to do is compare actual dispatch to optimal dispatch using the watt time GHG emission signal. And optimal dispatch suggests that, yes, there is more value that can be extracted from these systems. We found an average of about 17 kilograms per kWh capacity of observed GHG reduction in 2022. That was an average across the whole residential fleet. When we had batteries sort of follow the GHG marginal emission signal, we found a 3x improvement in GHG emissions when you optimize for it. So when the battery, this dark line is sort of what we observed in the program. When you're following that signal to optimize for GHG reductions, you see more inter-hour variability, more significant discharge during some hours, and certainly more utilization from more charging, lower state of charge at the end of the day. And then this heat map just kind of highlights the same thing. We're looking at above here, this is the combination of all residential projects, average discharge and charge by hour and month of the year. This is what we observed in the program in 2022. And this is looking at what the charge and discharge patterns look like average hourly by month and hour when you're optimizing for GHG. And again, to that point, you see much more inter-hour variability when you have that perfect foresight. So in conclusion, SGIP behind the meter energy storage technologies are providing GHG emission reductions. There's a lot of reasons for that. Minimum cycling requirements are great. One of the program requirements to sort of have minimal utilization is certainly driving that. Higher differential, the SGIP requires customers to be on higher differential on-peak, off-peak time use rates. That helps guide some of the behavior. And number 3, which is the battery operating mode. So someone who's doing time use arbitrage, the return on investment, the payback period, all become much more attractive when you're looking at a higher price differential time of use rate. And I will note here too, this is 2022, so these are all NEM customers, no net energy metering. There's no net billing tariff customers in this cohort or in the program at this time. And also demand response participation certainly helps with GHG emission reductions during some of those really critical emergency hours. And then access to that digital GHG signal are guiding that behavior. However, residential and non-res systems are not discharging the total capacity of the system regularly. Many res customers are limiting their discharge just to maintain that net zero load rather than exporting. So some program improvements to encourage additional battery utilization include increasing cycling minimums to better capture actual behavior, enrollment in virtual power plants where an aggregator can control a fleet of systems, or utility control storage. We see models of that here in the States that have success. Participation in real-time rates, where there's more granular rates than just the 4 to 9 on peak period. And we're seeing PV paired residential storage systems discharging roughly 45% of system capacity daily, standalone systems 22%. So we can encourage more targeted dispatches that emphasize the importance of discharging batteries during on-peak hours rather than just doing daily self-consumption. And then behind-the-meter storage paired with on-site PV. Obviously, when you're charging from early on-site PV generation, that's clean electrons being discharged. And if you're exporting to the grid, those are clean electrons, clean energy being exported. And charging also occurs during coincident to those lower grid scale emission hours. So when you're charging the battery, that's when the grid would rather you absorb some of that load rather than exporting or discharging. And then GHG emission differentials between charging overnight and discharging on peak, they're not sufficient, particularly in the summertime, to realize emission reductions for standalone systems like we see observed with PV paired systems charging from on-site PV. So having standalone systems, perhaps they could achieve reductions with the appropriate signal, perhaps the GHG signal or some kind of real-time pricing signal. And then finally, the optimization modeling reveals that average actual avoided emissions of 17 kilograms of GHG per kilowatt hour of capacity would triple if you can optimize for reduction. So, creating more ambitious GHG reduction targets, having more granular signals that developers and manufacturers and host customers and utilities and aggregators can get their hands on to extract more value from these DERs would certainly be beneficial moving forward. And with that, I will hand it back over to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That is really interesting. While we're switching over to Stefan, I just wanted to ask you a question. You said that with optimization, the benefits could be tripled, the GHG emissions reduction. Is there a cost associated with that optimization, or is that just a matter of what does that mean, optimization? Or is that like just changing the rules, or does that have to do with something that would require more? I'm just trying to get a sense of the cost benefit of the optimization.
Right. Yeah. So the cost element is not included in it. I mean, you could do some cost, I would say, co-optimization, where you're looking at sort of optimizing for utility avoided costs, for example. We have done that as well. I just wanted to focus in on GHG here. But you put in certain constraints on the battery. It can't go below a certain state of charge. You have a round trip efficiency that seems reasonable, a single cycle round trip efficiency of say 90%. And you're basically just discharging and charging the battery to follow that marginal emission signal, which is very granular per hour, much higher during summer hours. Oftentimes is very focused in on a couple of those hours during the on-peak period, whereas a customer is only seeing a broad signal of 4 to 9. They're being charged the same dollars per kWh from 4 to 9 o'clock, let's say 50 cents per kilowatt hour. The GHG signal may be 3 or 4 times higher at 6 o'clock than it was at 4 o'clock. And so the battery is shifting its sort of focus to optimize GHG reductions by then discharging more of the battery at that 6 o'clock hour, saving more of that, that capacity in the system to wait for that 6 o'clock hour. So it has perfect foresight. And so it allows the battery to sort of better capture the most benefit of reducing the GHG. So no cost element to it. We did look at sort of what the GHG reductions would look like if you, say, optimized for avoided costs, and vice versa, what the utility avoided costs would look like if you optimize for GHG. but I kind of focused the conversation exclusively on the GHG component.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, we're going to go on to Stefan from Sustainable Energy Advantage, talking about the Massachusetts Clean Peak Standard.
Hi folks, I'm Stefan Wallenberg. I have the unenviable task of going after Brian, who has more data, prettier graphs, and unfortunately is a great presenter too. But we're going to go for it. I still think that there's a lot to be learned from sort of a comparison between SCHIP and the Massachusetts CPS. What you're going to hear is that the programs are designed with different priorities. They're at different parts of their evolution, and they're just very different programs for a lot of different reasons. And we're going to talk about what that means from the perspective of emissions. So just briefly, I'm a director at SCA, Sustainable Energy Advantage. The reason I'm talking today is because SCA was a consultant to the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources with our partner, Customized Energy Solutions. We provided modeling that enabled DER as they were developing regulations when CPS was first implemented. And we also provide an ongoing service called the Clean Peak Market Outlook, which is, again, focused just on this market. Interestingly, our focus there is generally on the supply of certificates, the amount of storage that is likely to come online, and ultimately the price of these certificates. So it's interesting for me to get to step back and look at the program through a different lens, specifically emissions, which frankly is not something that we do very regularly, which you will see reflected in some of the slides that I shared today. So I'm a storyteller. I think that the most relevant beginning part of this story is going back to 2016. Massachusetts releases the State of Charge report, and it is a report that is very much focused on, not very much focused, that is about the opportunity of storage to provide benefits to the state of Massachusetts. The thing that really struck me in Brian's presentation, many things, but one of the things that struck me was his emphasis on how there was a transition from SCHIP focusing on reducing peak demand to reducing emissions. I think it's an interesting juxtaposition with Massachusetts because in the State of Charge report, there was this overriding emphasis on addressing peak demand. People weren't necessarily saying, well, load factor, but effectively they were talking about load factor. They were talking about how peak demands were driving system costs in Massachusetts. Obviously, there was also an acknowledgement and an emphasis that that correlated with emissions during those peak hours, but ultimately there was a lot of emphasis on costs, system costs associated with those peak hours. You saw that reflected, let's see if I can get to the next slide here. Yes. You saw that reflected in the statute that followed. So 2018, the enabling legislation passes. The statute itself is very thin. It doesn't specify whether emissions are the goal or whether peak load reduction is the goal. But in the announcements, in the discussion, there is very much an emphasis on getting storage developed, reducing peak demands, and emissions are sort of also in there. The policy goes into effect in 2020. And if we look at from DER's perspective, based on the straw proposal that they released when they were developing the regulations, there were an array of different goals for this policy. Flatten net electric load curve, reduce system costs, encourage storage deployment, and yes, of course, also reduce emissions. All of these things we will all understand are very much related, but if you were to design a policy for instance, just reducing system costs versus just reducing emissions, you would end up with different policies. So what is CPS? It is like a renewable portfolio standard in that it is a market-based, certificate-based policy that places an obligation on load-serving entities to procure a certain number of certificates. But that is where many of the similarities end. There are a lot of other complications, interesting things that make it CPS and not just your typical RPS. So perhaps most relevantly, the way that CPS, the Clean Peak Standard, operates is by designating certain hours during which certificates can be generated. These hours you see sort of on the right-hand most side of this chart. They vary by season. They are always a 4-hour window, and they are always the same on every day. That's an important part of the policy. Similarly, CPS tries to encourage storage to charge from renewables or during low emissions hours. it allows for several pathways to basically meet the criteria for, again, charging from renewables or low emissions resources. Those criteria include physical co-location with renewables, a direct bilateral contract with renewables from which the storage would charge, or, and this is the pathway that almost all storage resources participating in CPS choose, you can charge during hours that have been specified by DOER to be high hours when there will be large amounts of generation either from wind, and you see that on the leftmost side of this graph, or solar, which is sort of that chunk in the middle. We're going to talk about what that actually means for whether the policy achieves emissions reductions, but this is the way that the policy tries to encourage emissions reductions. Other components of the policy I'm going to go through more quickly. CPS has multipliers. The thing that I want to highlight here is that you can generate more certificates during the summer and the winter, 4 times more certificates specifically, because those are when ISO New England tends to have the highest peaks. It is not necessarily when there's the greatest emissions reduction potential. Similarly, again, there's an additional multiplier associated with output, discharge, load curtailment, depending on what type of resource you are, during the monthly peak hour. You can generate 25 times as many certificates during that monthly peak hour. That peak hour and that magnitude of benefit is very clearly targeted at cost reductions, because that is something that can produce cost reductions from a capacity perspective, and also transmission cost out, basically the way that transmission costs in New England are allocated. By reducing that load during those hours, there are opportunities to impact those system costs. There are a number of other, obviously, critical elements of the policy that I'm not going to talk about, except to mention briefly that CPS is also different from SCHIP in that it has a different set of eligible resources. In addition to behind the meter storage, front of the meter storage, both distribution and transmission connected is eligible. Load curtailment, demand response, EV demand response, all sorts of technologies, and also certain renewables are all eligible, which again make the policy dynamic, interesting, complicated. But for today, I'm going to focus on the emissions impact specifically of storage participating in the policy. Okay, so how's it been going? CPS is very much in its sort of growing stage still. I mentioned that it went into effect in 2020. Here we are a couple of years later. Supply has not reached anywhere near the level of demand that was set in the initial regulations. So this graph, very simple graph, shows estimated total obligation as that yellow line, and the actual number of these certificates, I'm going to call them CPEX, Clean Peak Energy Certificates, that have been issued as the dark blue bars. So clearly, there has not been as much supply as there is demand. This is going to change a little bit based on emergency regulations that were promulgated, I guess, about a week and a half ago at this point, which reduced the demand to try to allow supply and demand to reach balance a little bit more quickly. But for now, certainly the market is very undersupplied. So the question, is CPS reducing emissions? The short answer is probably not much yet. In answering this question, I'm going to reference a couple of studies that have been performed on the topic. I'm going to show a little bit of original analysis a little bit later on, but we don't have access to the same amount of data, the same type of data that Verdant does. So a lot of this is going to be based on modeled likely behavior of storage and not necessarily observed behavior of storage. So starting on the right, there was a paper released in 2019 before CPS was actually implemented that found that the policy was, well, as you can read here, ineffective at achieving emissions reductions goals. Basically, this paper was critical of the design of the policy itself for a number of reasons. I'm not going to get into all of the details, but basically it found that at a high level, the operation of batteries in CPS would actually increase emissions as opposed to decreasing emissions. More recently, the Commonwealth commissioned a study called the Charging Forward Study, primarily focused on mid and long duration storage, but it also looked at sort of a high level, a couple of things that are happening today, including CPS. And basically what they found there, and this is really the key part of my message today, is that New England just doesn't have a sufficient emissions arbitrage opportunity to allow storage today to deliver meaningful emissions reductions. And that is really at the center of what CPS is and is not doing for emissions. Oop, I missed a slide there. Let me see if I can get back. Samantha, it's hopping around on me a little bit. Do you mind taking me back a couple of slides? One more. And one more. It should be, I think, why not number 1. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So as I said, one of the key challenges is just the nature of the emissions profile in New England. Again, really critical here to hit on marginal versus average emissions. So I think this was obvious to most, but just to make sure we're speaking the same language. When we say marginal, we mean the emissions associated with the unit that is on the margin. So any incremental increase in supply or demand would cause a change in emissions associated with that marginal unit. So you could have moments when you have really low really low average emissions because there's a lot of generation from zero emissions resources, but still have marginal emissions because the marginal unit is a gas plant or something like that. So in New England, the reality today is that natural gas is still effectively always on the margin. Not actually always, but very nearly always on the margin. So you see that reflected in this graph on the right here. I would draw your attention to the y-axis on this graph. Things are actually much flatter than this looks because the y-axis doesn't start always at 0. But even so, you can see that the marginal emissions profile, even over most seasons in New England, is relatively flat. In winter, you do see more opportunity for emissions arbitrage because in the winter in New England, when we're using natural gas both for electricity generation and for heating, you see oil peaker plants get fired up more frequently. And that can, again, provide opportunities for significant reductions in marginal emissions. This will change over time. We'll talk a little bit about that, but this will change over time. And you'll start to see graphs that are super exciting and look a little bit more like the graph that Brian showed, showing marginal emissions going down to 0 during portions of the day when there's high output from zero emissions resources and when load is relatively low. All right, I'm going to see if I can advance this slide without screwing things up. Okay. So that's the first reason that CPS is not delivering emissions, just the nature of the New England system. The second reason is the design of CPS itself. So CPS is designed, as I showed before, with these fixed windows during which these certificates can be generated. That means that resources will discharge during those hours in order to generate these certificates. The good thing about having those fixed hours is that it's easy for participants in the market to understand what it is they need to do to generate these certificates. The problem with using that fixed window approach is that peak emissions or even just peak demand will not always fall within a 4-hour window. This set of graphs on the right shows by season, each panel being a different season, the gray window showing the CPS seasonal window, basically when discharge will occur, and then the line itself showing the probability that the maximum demand in a given day will occur during a given hour. And what you'll see is that while the CPS windows capture the majority of those maximums, it doesn't capture all of them. And that's especially true during summer and spring. So you have a critical component of the policy design, again, some simplicity in understanding how to generate the certificates, working against the ability to actually achieve emissions reductions, short-term emissions reductions. So is this going to change over time? Short answer is yes. As we see more renewables will increasingly become the marginal resource, which will provide this opportunity for greater emissions arbitrage. Interestingly, the changes that we expect in New England will push average emissions down more quickly than it's going to change sort of the pattern of emissions over the course of the day, the pattern of marginal emissions over the course of the day, which is to say that achieving the type of immediate emissions based on marginal emissions rates that California is seeing is actually probably going to take a good more number of years in New England for us to start realizing. But short-term marginal emissions are one factor. They are one way of measuring the emissions impact of a policy like this. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on this, but we also looked at a different metric. So NREL, through its Cambium data sets, calculates what they call a long-run marginal emissions rate. The idea here is instead of just looking at the marginal unit and looking at the emissions impact associated with changes in demand associated with that marginal unit, they actually look at the ability for the entire system over time to change into response to changes in supply and demand potentially associated with something like the operation of storage. So those more systemic changes could include generator retirements, new generators coming online, transmission investments, those sorts of things. So when we used, and this is where we did some of our analysis, when we used the NREL long-run marginal emissions rate, resources that we modeled would actually start generating emissions improvements, emissions reductions today. So in some ways, it is a question of metrics and what your planning horizon is. And that's really where I just wanted to leave today. Focusing exclusively on short-run marginal emissions is a valid approach. Focusing on encouraging the establishment of a storage industry so that we can achieve, focusing on encouraging the establishment of a storage industry that we know will be required to meet clean energy and greenhouse gas mandates is another reasonable metric. And again, that would result in slightly different policies. Also, focusing on cost reductions could be a reasonable metric. Electrification is not compatible with extremely high electricity costs. So to the extent that storage can be used to manage system costs, that has indirect emissions impacts because it can, hypothetically, encourage the pace of electrification of space heating and transportation. All of these things work together. Are there opportunities for CPS in theory to maintain some of its core elements and generate more short-term emissions benefits? Probably, yes. One thing that could be done would be to update the CPS hours more regularly to make sure that they continue to align with both hours of high demand and high marginal emissions. Luckily in New England, those hours are very, very highly correlated, both demand, price, and emissions. You could also imagine that there could be a significant change in the design of a policy like CPS, where instead of using these specified hours, you move towards something that is not as rigid, but instead perhaps focuses, like SCHIP does, on emissions rates, or perhaps even just provides an incentive that reinforces the incentive provided by wholesale power prices. Again, since that does a pretty good job of aligning with emissions rates in Massachusetts, or in New England. All right, so I see the time. I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks so much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Let's get everybody back on camera. While we're doing that, let me just ask you to clarify, Stefan. So I understand this part of the structure of this this thing is that there are designated hours for discharging and charging that that if you hit those, you generate the credit, even if it doesn't necessarily align in that particular instance with the peak emissions hour. Is there a signal in ISO New England similar to the one that's being used in California that could be used to better, sort of optimize that battery response?
The short answer is no. So WattTime provides that sort of like real-time marginal emissions signal, as I understand it. Brian will correct me all of the times I'm wrong on that, but there's not a corollary in New England in that. As I mentioned briefly, and this was a slide that got cut because I always go long, I showed based on sort of like retrospective analyses that tried to establish that marginal emissions rate, I showed that there is that really strong correlation between price, wholesale energy price, and emissions. So one can use that as a proxy, even though it is not exactly emissions rate, since that signal does not exist in New England.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'm going to say that given the time and we have some really good questions, we're going to stretch this a bit past the hour. So if you've entered a question and you're really hoping to have it answered, stick with us. We'll go a little long and try to get to more of these as best we can. And Dr. Zook, if you can join us by video, please do. Otherwise, feel free to jump in if you want to address something.
And Todd,
great. Yeah.
Todd, would you just mind maybe front-loading Stefan's questions, because I know he's got a bit of a conflict. I'm available a little bit longer, so.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we have specific, program-specific questions here, but let's just start getting into these. I think a lot of these are applying to either program. So one question is whether optimizing battery use for greenhouse gas reduction has any impact on battery capacity over the life of the battery. So I guess that, in other words, does that kind of optimization impact the lifespan, the cycle life, the efficiency over time?
Yeah, so the model that we developed at Verdant for the optimization purposes utilizes a state of charge. We have a state of charge of 35%. And this is something we've talked about with industry leaders, manufacturers, developers. Generally speaking, most batteries, like a Powerwall, you're not going to want to cycle 100% for those reasons: warranty, life cycle, etc. Also, customers, in California, we see a really unfortunate wildfire occurring in Northern California right now. Customers would like to have some resiliency in the bag. If there's going to be extra, increased need for the battery, people still want to have that sort of resiliency adder on there. So we utilized a 35% state of charge to sort of maintain some of that sort of warranty, effective useful life, as well as providing a buffer to customers to have some, battery charge in the tank in the event of an outage. But again, that's state of charge. You can play with that, depending on the technology, depending on the use case, depending on the jurisdiction.
And all I was going to say is that in many ways, CPS amplifies wholesale market signals. There are different types of resources in CPS. Not all of them are participating in wholesale markets, but because CPS largely amplifies those signals, what we find in the modeling that we've done is that the number of equivalent round trip cycles is fairly similar with and without this policy. So what that suggests, right, is that you're not driving more degradation of the battery above and beyond what a resource would likely be doing anyway. It's not 100% true for all of the use cases, but generally.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Next question is there a rough number or rule of thumb for average CO2 reduction for each kilowatt hour of storage that you install? I have a feeling that the answer is going to be no, but it's an interesting question. Is there? Do you have a sort of rule of thumb as to, what's the relationship between how much storage you have and capacity you have and how much greenhouse gas reduction you can achieve?
Well, I think the short answer is less than zero. That's really, you want to be reducing emissions in aggregate rather than increasing them. So less than zero. In the SGIP, the way that systems are operating right now, this combination of customers doing self-consumption, utilizing only 40-50% of the battery, focusing in on an on-peak period and discharging the battery to sort of maintain that sort of net zero load without exporting a lot of these systems. You're getting about 17 kilograms of GHG reduction per kilowatt hour right now. So if you focus that, you increase demand response participation, you have more granular signals that maybe there's more of a discharge during one period versus another. There's more export of that clean energy to the grid at certain points in time. We saw that when you're optimizing by that watt time signal, you can get up to 54. So maybe the number is somewhere in between. I don't know.
I would say that you can only have a rule of thumb specific to a specific portion of the grid. Like if you took the same dispatch profile that Brian showed in California, you applied that to New England, you might actually be increasing emissions. So the rule of thumb has to be location specific.
Yeah, that signal too is location specific. It's based on locational marginal prices. That's just the average sort of across the kind of the program. But absolutely, yeah, I firmly confirm Stefan's point there.
Well, here's a question for Stefan. Where can this person wants to know where can they find data or an analysis that shows how ISO New England wholesale electricity prices correlate with greenhouse gas emissions?
So you sort of have to cobble things together a little bit. One of the studies that I linked to basically worked with folks from WattTime with a WattTime data set to establish that correlation. That was 2018-2019 data. I'm not sure if we're going to share the slides or not, but folks, there is a link to that presentation, to that article, excuse me, in my presentation. But ISO New England doesn't publish by hour marginal emissions rates or marginal units. It provides aggregated statistics. So the ISO itself does not provide the data that you need to establish that correlation.
Okay. Here's somebody asking, instead of using marginal emissions rates to determine emissions impacts, have there been efforts to use granular certificates to track clean electricity through the storage asset from charging to discharging? I say we have some interesting questions here.
I'm not aware of that. In CPS, again, there are multiple ways that storage can establish that is sort of meeting this general criteria that it is being charged from like low emissions sources. One of those, I think I did mention, is a direct bilateral contractual pathway. So that is not a certificate-based approach. It would be using a contract to establish that that relationship. I'm not aware of anyone doing anything more specific than that to track. Like, I'm not aware of a program where you have to like buy RECs in order to associate those RECs with, the charging of your system. And it raises interesting questions. Would that be on the basis of total charging energy, just round trip efficiency losses? Would those RECs have to be time denominated? Most RPSs don't work that way. It's a super interesting question, and I think the complexity of it is probably one of the reasons you don't see it in any policies, at least that I'm aware of.
Okay. Here's a question about battery safety. Do any of you have any insight on the safety record of behind-the-meter battery installations? Now, this person's asking specifically in the SGIP program, but I think, it's of general interest since a lot of the, we are seeing a lot of behind-the-meter battery deployment.
Yeah, there's obviously published literature out there with some different types of technologies and chemistries that haven't worked very well. There have been recalls, but a lot of those are several years old. Some technologies that perhaps are not being installed as much anymore. This is something that we don't really observe in the program. We do process evaluations and sort of communication with customers about their satisfaction with the program, their satisfaction with systems operating during public safety power shutoffs, for example. By and large, people are very happy with what the systems are doing for the purposes of what they're utilizing them for. So I know that safety is a concern for folks, but I think the track record in the program has been pretty good.
I think some of the situations where you do observe fires originate with taking scooters, for example, into your apartment. It's not the energy storage as such, it's the batteries in the scooters, and there is an unusual number of fires from that in a place like New York City, for example.
Yeah, I know, we have an upcoming webinar on the topic of sodium ion as a potential replacement chemistry for lithium ion for stationary storage. And I'm wondering, is there a safety benefit that comes along with that if we were to see that trend in the market? Anybody?
The sodium ion batteries?
Yes.
I would expect sodium-ion batteries to be somewhat safer than lithium batteries. Of course, sodium by itself is quite capable of going on fire, but when it's in combinations like sodium chloride, then it's just table salt, and you don't expect your table salt to be exploding.
No, I rarely see that happen. Okay. Has the trend of increasing residential projects continued since 2022? I think this is in reference to the California statistics. Is residential capacity greater than non-residential now?
Residential is greater than non-residential. Yes, that is true. Again, the self-generation incentive program, one of the objectives is greenhouse gas emission reductions. Another is market transformation. So providing incentives to customers to install these things, that sort of kind of creates a market, much like the California Solar Initiative did to rooftop solar, bringing prices down and more people installing these things. And we've seen a trend recently since the program is kind of out of budget now. We also see a significant number of non-SGIP installations. And actually in California, that has now outpaced SGIP installation. So at 45,000 or so, I said that I found from the SGIP program tracking database, residential non-SGIP batteries probably represent about 60,000, so more than 60% of all batteries installed now. And so, we're doing some work with the CPUC on that to identify how those systems are being utilized because we don't have access to the meter data for those systems. So trying to understand how these things are being utilized just using AMI data. Are they in backup mode? Are they being utilized for time use arbitrage versus self-consumption? Most non-residential systems are installed through the program. Obviously the economics of a non-residential behind-the-meter energy storage system, building it, all of that is much more price sensitive than a customer who just wants resiliency, a residential customer. So most of the non-residential capacity is within the SGIP. But seeing how many non-SGIP batteries are installed in California, certainly the capacity in the residential market is greater now.
Interesting. Any idea why people are installing batteries and not taking advantage of the SGIP incentives?
Well, one of the main reasons it's that the budgets have been completely drained, and so
okay.
And then some of the incentives are now they go through stepwise processes by which the first incentives are at $50 cents per watt hour of capacity, for example. Some of the sort of buckets that are now remaining are at like 15 cents per watt hour of capacity. And so going through the program and all of the sort of paperwork and all of the legwork to get this thing approved and interconnected, all that, some customers are just more inclined to just bypass the program altogether and not have to deal with any of that. And price point, prices have come down. Obviously, since the supply chain issues we had after COVID, prices have been going down. And so, batteries are perhaps a bit more affordable for folks. There's more products available on the market now than 5 or 6 years ago when you only had 2 or 3 kind of products to install. So, again, part of that market transformation, certainly not a transform market by any measure, but some of those trends are sort of evident in sort of what we see.
Great. Well, look, we've gone 10 minutes over. I really appreciate your sticking with us. That's all we're going to have time for. So thanks so much to all of the speakers, and it's been really interesting. These are 2 really interesting programs that take completely different approaches, and it'll be fascinating to see what the outcome is after a few more years. Samantha, do we have any final words or upcoming events that we want to talk about?
Yes, I just shared my screen. We've got a number, sorry about that. We've got a number of webinars coming up. You can read more details on those at cisa.org/webinars. Some are about community solar. We have one on August 15th I'm very excited about, California's first in the world flexible demand appliance standards program. And then in September, we have one in our Batteries 101 series on municipal considerations for battery energy storage in Massachusetts. So some exciting topics coming up. I hope people can attend those.
Right, and another STEF webinar, I think in September, on the sodium ion batteries that we were briefly discussing.
Yes, I think that is
And for those,
process of getting on the books.
right, and for those who were asking, the slides and the recorded webinar will both be available on the CISA website shortly. So thanks, everybody. Glad you could join us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.